They called it a gift, but Caleb Thorne knew it was a sentence. He stood in the dusty church hall, the air thick with the smell of old wood and self-righteousness, and felt the weight of every eye in the town of Prosperity. It wasn't just judgment in their gaze. It was worse. It was pity, a thick, sticky pity that was harder to wash off than dirt. He was the man who had gambled and lost, the rancher whose ambition had soared too close to the sun, and when his wings melted, he'd taken a good chunk of the town's money with him. They couldn't hang him, and they couldn't run him out of the county. That would be too simple, too clean. No, the good people of Prosperity had devised a crueler punishment, one they wrapped in the pretty paper of Christian mercy. Their solution was the old Miller homestead, a forgotten scrap of earth 3 miles out of town, where the sun had baked the hope right out of the soil. The cabin was a collection of rotting boards leaning on each other for support, a place where even the weeds seemed to have given up. It was an exile in plain sight, but they weren't just giving him a patch of dead land, they were giving him a wife. Her name was Mai. She was the town's other ghost, the silent widow of a Chinese railway worker who had the bad manners to die. She lived on the edge of town and on the edge of their society, a quiet, solitary figure they spoke of in whispers. The whispers said she was barren, cursed, a woman whose husband had left her with nothing, not even a child to carry his name. The preacher, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, presented it as a kind of perfect, twisted poetry, a broken man for a barren woman on a barren piece of land, a perfect trinity of failure. Mai was brought forward. She didn't look at Caleb. She didn't look at anyone. Her gaze was locked on the warped floorboards, her small frame radiating a quiet dignity that was a silent rebellion against the humiliation of the moment. For just a flicker of a second, Caleb caught her eye, and in the depths of her dark, unreadable gaze, he saw it. He saw the same suffocating loneliness that was eating him alive from the inside out. The absolute crushing certainty of being utterly and completely unwanted. The preacher cleared his throat, a smug little sound of a job well done. The town had passed its sentence. Their lives were over. Or so they thought. The wagon ride to their new home was a journey through a world without sound. The only noise was the tired creak of the wheels and the occasional sigh from the old mule, as if the animal itself understood the hopelessness of their situation. Caleb stared at the horizon, his jaw set so tight it ached. Beside him, Mai sat perfectly still, a small, worn bundle of her belongings held tightly in her lap. She was like a statue carved from silence. The homestead, when it finally came into view, was even worse than he remembered. The cabin didn't just sag. It looked like it was in a constant state of apology for still standing. The porch roof dipped in a permanent, defeated bow. The well was a clogged throat of debris and mud. The field was a graveyard, the headstones being the stubborn rocks that littered the landscape. This wasn't a place where hope had come to die. It was the place hope had been buried. For the first week, they were two planets in a forced, silent orbit. They moved around each other in the small one-room cabin, their movements dictated by necessity, not communication. He didn't speak to her. She didn't speak to him. It was a language of absence. Caleb spent his days wrestling with the choked well, hauling up bucket after bucket of foul-smelling muck. It was back-breaking work, a penance paid to the unforgiving earth. While he worked, he could hear the faint, rhythmic sounds of her efforts inside. The scrape of a tool, the swish of a broom. She was battling years of dust and decay, trying to impose some small order on the chaos. He would come back to the cabin at dusk, exhausted and caked in mud, to find a bowl of thin, hot broth on the rough-hewn table. It was made from roots and weeds she'd foraged, but it was warm. He would eat, and she would be on the other side of the room, her back to him, mending a piece of cloth. He never saw her watch him eat, but he knew she did. In the morning, before he left to continue his work, he would leave a pile of chopped firewood by the door. When he returned, some of it would be gone. There were no words of thanks, no acknowledgments, just the wood and the broth, a silent transaction of survival. They slept on opposite sides of the room, two separate islands of loneliness. The only thing between them was the dying embers of the fire, a small, flickering truce in the vast, cold darkness of the cabin. He was the outcast. She was the hermit. This wasn't a marriage. It was a shared prison sentence. Sometimes he'd see her standing by the doorway, staring out at the dead field. Her expression was a mask he couldn't read. He wondered what she saw out there. He wondered about the husband she'd lost, the man who had brought her across an ocean to this strange, hard country, only to abandon her to its cruelty. He wondered what promises had been whispered in a language he didn't understand, promises that had turned to dust just like the land around them. He saw her staring at the ground, and a strange thought entered his mind. She wasn't looking at what was there. She was looking at what wasn't. The first crack in the wall of silence wasn't a word. It was the turning of the earth. One morning, Caleb saw Mai out in the rocky patch of dirt beside the cabin. She was on her knees using a sharpened stick to break up the hard, compacted soil. Her movements were slow, patient, methodical. It was a fool's errand. Nothing could grow here. The whole town knew it. Yet she persisted. He watched her for a long time from the collapsing barn he was trying to reinforce. He had a spare spade, but the handle was cracked. That afternoon, instead of working on the barn, he sat in the shade and carefully repaired the handle. He wrapped it with strips of leather, pulling them tight, testing the strength. He didn't know why he was doing it. It wasn't his concern. But he couldn't shake the image of her, a small, determined figure fighting a losing battle with a stick. He didn't hand the spade to her. That would have been too much, a gesture too loud for their silent world. Instead, he simply left it leaning against the cabin wall near the patch of dirt where she worked. He went back to the barn, his heart hammering for reasons he couldn't explain. The next morning he looked out. The sharpened stick was gone, and in its place the spade rose and fell, making a steady, rhythmic thud against the stubborn ground. She was working faster now with a new energy, a small victory. A few days later, he was sinking a new fence post under the brutal afternoon sun. Sweat dripped into his eyes, his throat was a desert. He straightened up to wipe his brow and saw it. Sitting on the top of the post beside him was a tin cup, filled with cool water from the well he had cleared. He looked toward the cabin. He saw her silhouette in the dark doorway for just a second, a fleeting shadow before she disappeared back inside. He picked up the cup and drank. The water was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. This was their new language, a mended handle, a cup of water. It wasn't about kindness, not yet. It was about respect, an acknowledgement of a shared struggle against a world that had written them off. The small, rocky plot of land became her entire world. She poured all of her silent energy into it. It was her garden, her kingdom of dirt. And as Caleb worked on the larger, more practical tasks, patching the roof, rebuilding the barn, mending the fences, he found himself becoming the guardian of her small, impossible dream. He started clearing the larger rocks from her plot, rolling the heavy stones to the edge to form a crude, protective wall. He never asked her what she was doing. He never questioned the point of pouring so much effort into land that everyone knew was cursed. He just watched this silent, determined woman trying to bring life from death, and a part of him started to believe she could do it. But he also noticed something strange. She wasn't just clearing the land. She seemed to be searching. Every time her spade hit a large rock, she would stop, her body tense before carefully digging around it. It was as if she was looking for one particular stone, or something that wasn't a stone at all. The sky had been a menacing, bruised purple for hours, a silent warning. Then the storm broke. It didn't come with a gentle rain. It came with a howl, a sudden, violent fury of wind that tore at their small cabin like a hungry predator. Rain hammered the roof, a deafening drumbeat that turned the world outside into a churning, gray chaos. A powerful gust hit the old barn, and Caleb heard the sickening crack of splintering wood. He didn't hesitate. He ran out into the deluge. A large section of the barn wall had been ripped away, exposing their single mule and handful of chickens to the full fury of the storm. The wind was a physical force, pushing him back, stealing his breath. He fought his way to the terrified animals, trying to herd them toward the relative safety of the cabin. His clothes were soaked in an instant, the cold rain chilling him to the bone. Suddenly she was there. Mai appeared beside him, a ghost in the storm. Her small frame was braced against the wind, her long black hair plastered to her face. In one hand she held a length of rope, in the other a lantern. its flame a tiny, fragile speck of light battling the raging darkness. They didn't speak a word. They didn't need to. She moved with a surprising quickness to calm the frantic mule, speaking to it in soft tones that were lost in the roar of the wind. Caleb scrambled to secure a loose door that was banging violently against its frame, threatening to tear itself apart. They worked as a team, a frantic, unspoken partnership born of pure instinct. Together they managed to wrestle the animals into a small lean-to behind the cabin, barricading the opening with loose boards just as the storm reached its terrifying peak. They stumbled back inside the cabin, soaked, shivering, and breathless. The door groaned shut behind them, sealing them in their small, fragile sanctuary. For a long moment, they just stood there, dripping on the dirt floor, the only sound their own ragged breathing and the roar of the storm outside. That night, they sat on opposite sides of the hearth. The fire crackled and spit, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. They were wrapped in dry blankets, sharing the warmth. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't an empty, awkward void anymore. It was a shared space, a comfortable quiet, filled with the unspoken knowledge that they had faced the storm together, and they had won. In the calm, clean-washed world after the rain, something between them had shifted, settled into a new place. The walls were still there, but the storm had washed away some of the mortar. One evening, a few days later, the air was cool and clean. The first tentative green shoots were finally pushing their way through the soil in Mai's garden. It was a miracle, a tiny, defiant victory against the barren land. Caleb walked over to where she was tending to the small plants. He stood for a moment, just watching the gentle, careful way her fingers moved, brushing the dirt from a new leaf. "It's a good start," he said. His voice was quiet, rough from disuse. She didn't look up at him, but she didn't pull away. She stayed right where she was, her hands hovering over a small green sprout. "My husband," she began, and her voice was so soft it was like the rustle of dry leaves. It was the first time she had ever spoken of him. "He said I had a gift for making things grow." Caleb leaned against the crude rock wall he had built around her garden. He didn't say anything. He just waited, giving her the space to continue if she wanted to. "He was a good man," she said, her eyes still on her plants. "He was strong. He promised me a garden one day, a big one, filled with flowers from my home." She paused and her fingers gently traced the edge of a new leaf. "He died. Before the first winter, the fever took him." Her voice was flat, a simple statement of a devastating fact. "After he was gone, there was no one, and no baby came." She finally looked up, not at Caleb, but at the town of Prosperity, a distant smudge on the horizon. "The women in town, they looked at me with pity. They whispered. They said I was empty. Barren." The word hung in the still evening air. Barren. A label. A judgment. Caleb felt a sudden, sharp pang of understanding. He knew what it was like to be defined by your failures, to have your name stripped away and replaced with a label. Failed rancher. Barren widow. "I lost a herd of cattle," he heard himself say. The words came out before he could stop them, a confession he hadn't planned to make. "My own foolish pride. A bad winter came, and I thought I knew better than the old-timers. I lost everything, not just the money. I lost my father's name." They stood there in silence as the sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. Two outcasts sharing the ghosts of their past failures, while the land around them listened. But as Mai looked back down at her garden, Caleb saw it again, a flicker of something in her eyes. She wasn't just telling him about her husband. She was telling him something else. The garden wasn't just about growing things, it was about finding something. The promise her husband had made, it wasn't just about flowers. It was something more. Life on the homestead found a new rhythm. It was a quiet partnership, a dance of shared work and unspoken understanding. The place that was meant to be their prison was slowly, painstakingly, becoming a home. Mai's garden was a defiant splash of green in a world of brown. It was thriving. Caleb had finished repairing the barn, making it sturdy enough to withstand the next storm. He'd mended the last of the fences. They still didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable now, a shared blanket instead of a dividing wall. One afternoon, Caleb was checking the line of snares he'd set in the low rolling hills to the east of their property. It was a clear, bright day, the sky an endless, piercing blue. And then he saw it, a plume of black smoke, thick and oily, rising into the sky. It was too much for a campfire, too dark. A cold knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He urged his horse into a trot, his eyes fixed on the column of smoke. As he crested the final rise, the scene below made him pull the horse to a sudden stop. Down in a ravine, an overturned wagon lay splintered and broken. Its contents were scattered across the ground like toys discarded by a careless giant. One of the wheels was still spinning slowly, a last futile gesture of a journey cut short. The smoke was coming from a small fire that had started in the dry grass nearby. He scrambled down the rocky incline, his boots slipping on the loose stones. His heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was a scene of absolute tragic finality. But then he heard it, a sound so small, so out of place in the grim silence. It felt unreal, a thin, wavering cry, a baby's cry. He followed the sound, his eyes scanning the wreckage. There, tucked away in a small bundle of blankets that had been miraculously thrown clear of the crash, was the source of the sound. He knelt down and gently, with trembling hands, pulled back the cloth. A baby stared up at him. Its face was red and streaked with tears, its tiny fists balled in distress. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. Caleb's gaze swept the silent ravine. There were no other survivors. The stillness was absolute. He was alone out here, with the wail of an orphan and the vast, indifferent wilderness. Carefully, he lifted the infant, holding it awkwardly against his chest. The baby's cries softened into small whimpers, its tiny body warm against him. And in that moment, holding this small, helpless, fragile life, Caleb felt something shift deep inside him. A fierce, protective instinct he never knew he had, surging through him like a wildfire. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a turning point. And as he looked back at the wagon, he saw something that made the hair on his arm stand up. The axle of the remaining wheel hadn't just broken, it was cut. Sawn almost all the way through, designed to break on a rough patch of road. This wasn't an accident, it was murder. When Caleb walked into the cabin, the baby cradled in his arms, Mai was grinding corn. She looked up and her eyes widened, first at his disheveled, smoke-stained state, then at the bundle he was carrying. He didn't have to say a word. The entire story was written on his face. The shock, the horror, the grim discovery. She rose slowly from her stool, wiping her hands on her apron, and walked toward him. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She peered down at the infant, who had started to whimper again, and Caleb saw an expression on her face he had never seen before. Her usually guarded, unreadable features softened into a look of such profound, aching tenderness that it took his breath away. Without a moment of hesitation, she reached out her arms. "Let me," she whispered, the first words either of them had spoken since he'd returned. He carefully transferred the small, warm bundle into her arms. The baby, as if sensing a new and gentler presence, quieted almost immediately. Its small head nestled into the crook of her neck, and a tiny hand clutched a piece of her dark hair. That evening, their small, quiet cabin was transformed. The solitude was gone, replaced by the small, tentative sounds of a new life. Mai, with an instinct that seemed to rise from a deep, hidden well inside her, cared for the child. She moved with a gentle, confident efficiency that amazed Caleb. She fashioned diapers from old flour sacks. She fed the baby a thin gruel of cornmeal and water from the tip of her finger, humming a soft, wordless lullaby as she did. Caleb spent the evening by the fire, not repairing tools or mending leather, but carving a cradle. He found a discarded wooden crate in the barn, and with his sharpest knife, began to shape it into a small bed. He watched his wife, this woman the world had called barren, as she held the child. Her face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, was radiant. He didn't see the outcast widow the town had thrown away. He saw a mother. The baby, a boy, had brought something new and unexpected into their home. It was more than just another mouth to feed, another life to worry about. He was a catalyst, a tiny, helpless creature who was forcing them to become something more than two lonely people sharing a roof. They were, without realizing it, becoming a family. The town's cruel joke had been answered by a miracle, a foundling in the wilderness. But as Caleb looked at the sleeping infant, he couldn't shake the image of the sawn axle. This child wasn't just an orphan. He was a survivor. And whoever had wanted his parents dead might not be happy that he was still alive. News, even in a desolate place like this, travels on the wind. It wasn't long before the sound of an approaching buggy broke the quiet of the homestead. A man in a stiff suit and a bowler hat pulled his horse to a stop in their yard. He carried a leather ledger and an air of officious authority that seemed entirely out of place in their rough-hewn world. His name, he announced, was Arthur Finch, a banker from the next county over. His tone was cold, devoid of sympathy. He explained that the family in the wagon, the Abernathys, had been heavily in debt to his bank. The wagon, the horse, its contents. They were all now bank property to be seized to cover the losses. He spoke of the tragedy as a simple matter of accounting. Then he turned his attention to the cradle by the fire. As for the child, he said, his voice flat, he is to be taken to the state orphanage, a ward of the county. Finch spoke of the boy not as a human being, but as a loose end, a complication on a balance sheet. It is the law, he stated, peering around the simple cabin with a disdainful sniff. The child requires proper care, not to be raised in a place like this, by people like you. The insult hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. A cold, hard anger rose in Caleb's chest. But it was Mai who moved first. She had been standing silently by the cradle, a sentinel. Now she stepped forward, physically placing herself between the banker and the sleeping baby. She didn't say a word, but her posture, the fierce, protective fire that blazed in her eyes, was a declaration of war. This man would not take her child, because in her heart, in the space of just a few days, that is what the boy had become, her son. Caleb moved to stand beside her, a silent, unbreachable wall. The boy stays here, Caleb said. His voice was low, steady, but laced with a core of steel that surprised even himself. Finch scoffed, a short, ugly sound. You have no legal claim. You are nothing to him. We're the ones who found him, Caleb countered, his voice rising. We're the ones who've cared for him. We cleaned him, we fed him, we kept him warm. That makes us something. The banker's face hardened into a mask of cruel determination. This is not over, he hissed. I will be back, and I will have the sheriff with me. As Finch turned to leave, Caleb noticed something. Tucked into the banker's fine leather boot was a small, ornate silver flask. It was unique, intricately carved, and Caleb felt a jolt of ice in his veins. He'd seen a flask just like it lying in the dirt near the wrecked wagon. Finch was a man of his word. 2 days later, he returned. But he didn't just bring the sheriff. With him was a small procession of riders from Prosperity. The preacher was there, his face a mask of solemn concern. Several of the town councilmen were there, the same men who had sentenced Caleb to this exile. They hadn't come to help. They had come to watch, to witness the final, predictable act of his failure. They gathered in the yard, a silent jury, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim satisfaction. They were here to see the law confirm what they already believed, that a man like Caleb and a woman like Mai were unfit, incapable of creating anything but ruin. Finch, emboldened by his audience, strode onto the small porch as if he owned it. Sheriff, he began, his voice loud and clear for all to hear, I am here to take possession of the orphan child, as is my legal right. The sheriff, a weary-looking man named Tate, looked from the smug banker to the couple standing in the cabin doorway. Caleb stood tall, his face set like stone. Beside him, Mai held the baby, wrapped tightly in a blue blanket. She wasn't looking at the sheriff or the crowd. Her gaze was fixed on Finch, an unblinking, burning intensity that was more powerful than any weapon. He has a name, Mai said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and strong, and it rang out across the silent yard, cutting through the tension. Every eye turned to her. His name is Anne, she said. It means peace. It was a challenge, a refusal to let them reduce her son to an asset on a ledger. Caleb stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her. "This is our home," he said, and his voice carried the weight of every rock he had moved, every nail he had hammered, every quiet moment of shared hardship that had transformed this place. "And this is our son." He locked eyes with the preacher, then with each of the councilmen. "You are not taking him." For the first time, the people of prosperity were not looking at two separate outcasts. They were looking at a family. They saw a man and a woman standing together as one, a portrait of fierce, unshakable devotion. They saw the neat, thriving garden, a patch of impossible green. They saw the repaired barn, the solid fence line. They saw that this land they had deemed barren was no longer barren. They saw that these two people they had called broken were no longer broken. They had taken a punishment and turned it into a home. And at the center of that home was a child they would clearly die to protect. But Caleb knew it wasn't enough. He had one last card to play. He looked directly at Finch. "It's a nice flask you carry, Mr. Finch," he said, his voice calm and even. "Silver, isn't it? With a fancy bird carved on it." Finch's eyes widened in shock. The preacher and the councilman exchanged nervous glances. "I found one just like it," Caleb continued, "lying in the dirt, not 10 feet from the wagon, right next to the axle that had been sawn through." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. The sheriff's head snapped toward Finch, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. The narrative had just been shattered. This wasn't about the law or an orphan's welfare. This was about a cover-up. The preacher, the man whose voice had condemned them months ago, was the first to find his voice. He cleared his throat, but the sound was shaky. He looked at the family on the porch, at the thriving homestead, and then at the suddenly pale and sweating banker. He saw not a punishment fulfilled, but a conspiracy unraveling. "Mr. Finch," the preacher said, his tone suddenly measured and thoughtful, trying to distance himself from the disaster. "While the letter of the law may be on your side, it seems to me that the spirit of it is standing right here." He gestured toward Caleb and Mai. "This child has a home, a good one." One by one, the other men from the town, the ones not on the council, murmured their agreement. They had come expecting to see a ruin, but they had found a sanctuary. They had come to gloat over a failure, but they had stumbled upon a crime scene. The collective will of the community, once turned so cruelly against Caleb and Mai, now turned like a cornered animal against the greedy outsiders. Sheriff Tate, seeing the tide turn, sighed and tipped his hat. "Finch," he said, his voice hard, "it seems the town has spoken. There's nothing for you here." His eyes narrowed. "But you and I are going to have a long talk about that wagon and that flask." Defeated and exposed, Finch could only sputter in protest before turning and practically running back to his buggy. The councilmen, their faces ashen, began to back away, trying to melt into the crowd. But it was too late. The secret was out. The townspeople lingered. Their expressions changed from scorn to a dawning respect. A few of them offered quiet, hesitant nods before they mounted their horses and rode away, leaving behind a new kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of exile. It was the silence of acceptance. Caleb looked at Mai. She was gazing down at the sleeping child in her arms, her face serene. He reached out his hand, and for the first time, he gently touched her cheek. She leaned into his touch for just a moment, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had survived, everything they had won. They had been sent to this desolate place as a cruel joke, a punishment meant to break their spirits. But here on this land the world had forgotten, they had found more than just survival. They had found justice. They had found redemption. They had found each other. And they had discovered that a family isn't something you are born into. It's something you build, with your own two hands and a stubborn heart, in the wilderness of a lonely world. What started as a sentence had become their salvation. They had everything they needed, right here on this small patch of earth. They had their home, they had their son, and they had a future. If you enjoyed the story of justice and redemption, don't forget to like and subscribe, because there are always more secrets buried in the dust, waiting for someone brave enough to dig them up.